Hello guys, and welcome back to the Summer Day Studios YouTube channel. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at creating a glass shader using Arnold and Maya. Glass is a material which is very easy to create because realistically it's just transparent and shiny, right? But it's actually a little bit more complicated than that if we want to make it look realistic. When you look at glass, of course it's transparent, but there's a lot more detail there that you might actually overlook, like specks of dirt or just even leftover residue from water. Let's say if it's rained, you get bits of sediment and minerals just drying on there, and that will often come in the form of what looks like slightly rougher parts of the glass, and a lot of that adds up to create the realism of it. In today's video we're not going to be doing procedural shading. We'll probably make a whole separate video tutorial on that, so you will need UVs for your model. I just have this kind of old school Coca-Cola bottle with some very simple UVs on here because we're going to be using image textures to create the kind of roughness and bumpiness that we want on this slightly older glass look that we're going for today. You're also going to need some surface imperfection texture maps, which I will provide the links for in the description. You can get those for free from websites like Ambient CG and Polyhaven, both absolutely fantastic sites, not just for surface imperfection textures, but all sorts of things, PBR textures from brick to metals, woods, and so on. So I'd highly recommend you check those out before starting this. So let's get right into it. So with our model here in the scene, we're going to start out just by right-clicking, going to Assign New Material, and we're going to be using the new AI Open PBR surface. This AI doesn't stand for Artificial Intelligence, by the way. It just is related to Arnold. So click that, and that will apply that to our model. First things first, we're going to rename that to Glass Shader as well. And then what I like to do just to get us started off is go to presets up here and then come down to where it says glass and then just click replace. That's going to do a lot of the settings for us already. It's going to set the roughness and the transmission to 1, so this is actually transparent. But while we're creating shaders, we want to be able to preview this, do an interactive render, so that if we're making any changes, we can actually see that live as we add things. So first things first, come over to the Arnold tab and just click on this button here to create a sky dome light. We're going to be using an HDRI image for this, and you can also get those for free from Polyhaven and Ambient CG, like mentioned before. I have a pretty big collection of them. Anyone will do, really. The reason why we're going for this is because glass, like metal, is very reflective, and a lot of what makes up the visual appeal, or the visual substance, if you like, of glass, is what it reflects. So we're going to go ahead and create that. Come over to Color, click on this little checkerboard here, and then go to File. And I'm going to come to where I keep all my HDRIs stored, and I'm just going to pick one here. You can get them up to 8K resolution, 1K, 2K, 3K, 4K. I like to go for 4K as a nice middle ground. You don't necessarily have to. And then there's a few settings here that we'll just change right off the bat. Change max bounces to 10, just because 999 is way too high. We don't need that many, it will just slow down the render. I also like to turn the transmission to 0. That will just mean that the light we will get the reflections on the bottle, but we won't be able to see the environment through the bottle. That'll make sense in a moment when we render this. I also like to change the camera to 0 as well, so we don't see this in the render. And then increase the samples up to something like 3, just to make the light quality a bit better, and the exposure up to 1, so it's a bit brighter for us. Last thing I like to do is come down to viewport. That might be collapsed by default, so just click that. Where it says sky radius, just reduce this to 0, and that looks like the light's just vanished into thin air. It is still there, it just means we can't see it in the viewport, but the light does in fact still work. Just makes it a bit cleaner. You don't have to do that step, it's just something I like to do. Anyway, now we can go up to render here and then click on Arnold, and you'll now see we have a transparent bottle. And if we zoom in close to this, it will take a little bit to render depending on your machine, and it's transparent, so generally those things take longer to render in general. But you can see here we're getting all this nice reflectivity from the sky dome light that I mentioned, and without this the glass would look very plain, and we couldn't really view it as well as we could have if we hadn't used the HDRI. Okay, so that's a good start. But how can we improve this? So like I mentioned earlier, when you look at glass, yes, it has the transmission, the transparency, but if you really get up close, it has all sorts of little bits of detail in it, unless you've very recently cleaned your windows, but even then, if they're quite old, it's going to have little specks of dirt and like leftover water residue and stuff like that. So how do we recreate this? Well, we can use maps to control the roughness of our glass. by default, right, if we come to our material again under the attribute editor, the roughness is just set to 0. If I was to put that all the way to 1, you can now see our glass now looks like stone. So the lower that is, basically, the more transparent it's going to look, right? While transmission does drive the actual see-through ability, if that's even a word or a phrase, of the transmission of the glass, roughness is kind of like adding a bunch of tiny little bumps to glass. If you ever had like the kind of glass you get in bathrooms, right? So people can't see in when you're showering, stuff like that. Like frosted glass, that's going to be bumpier, so that it disperses the reflections. So that's what we're going to be taking advantage of today to give some visual interest to this. So go ahead and pause the render for now, just to save our computers from dying, and click on this little blue ball up here. This is going to open up the Hypershade editor, okay? And then you can see up here we have our materials. We have the glass shader we can see here, so just select that. You'll know it's selected because it will be have this yellow box around it. Then just click this button here to graph the inputs, so we can see that in our graph here. So we have our graph shader, or our glass shader, sorry, in the graph, and all sorts of different inputs, but the one we're looking for particularly here is the specular roughness, so we want to plug something into that. So if you just press left-click anywhere in the graph, type or press tab on your keyboard, and then just type in file. There's a few different options, but we're looking for file texture because we're going to be using an image texture. Okay, click on that node, come over to the right-hand side again, and there's this input here for image name. We're just going to click the folder icon, and then navigate to where you've stored any of your textures. And you'll want ones which are black and white, like this. It's not 100% necessary that they're black and white. You could have color information in them too, but black and white ones are the sort of most optimal ones to use. Once you've got that selected, just click Open. That will then add it to the file node, and we can go ahead and plug that right in. But the thing is, with the specular roughness input, if I was to just left click here on the color and try to plug that in, you can see it grays out and it doesn't actually let us do it. That's because the specular roughness is not actually expecting to get any color information like this output does here. It's more expecting data in the form of ones and zeros, essentially a black and white image. So in order to do that and only give it one color, weirdly enough, we only have to do the out color red or green or blue. It's up to you. I normally go with red just because it's the one at the top. And then we can plug that into the specular roughness. Okay. So if we then minimize our Hypershade editor, because we'll need that later, that will just come down to the bottom here. And then come back and go to render and then Arnold again. And you'll see that's actually done nothing. And you might be thinking, oh, why is that? My glass still looks perfectly reflective and smooth. So the reason is because we actually need to change a setting within the files. And you only really need to do this with things like roughness maps, specular maps, and normal and bumper maps too. But we'll get to those in a minute. So with your file here selected, there's a few settings we need to change as well. Under color space, you're going to want to change this to raw. So come down to utility and then click on raw. The reason we want to change that to raw is because, like I said earlier, these maps are not actually providing any color information. We're just telling the shader how rough an object is going to be through a black and white image. You also want to tick on alpha is luminance. This one's very important, otherwise this kind of map generally won't work. And that's why when we rendered it, we couldn't actually see any of our roughness coming through. Essentially what this does, in as simplest terms as possible, is it takes the luminance or the brightness of the color, the red, green and blue, and pipes it into the alpha. So that your RGB texture basically just becomes mask based on how bright the pixels are. And what this means is that bright white parts of the texture map will be opaque, while dark black parts will be transparent. And that's where we'll get our kind of gritty, dirty look to the roughness. And another thing I like to do as well is just click this ignore color space file rules. You don't have to tick that necessarily, it will still work, but if you don't tick that, Maya's going to complain and whine about it every time, so I like to just tick that too. So now if we go ahead and render, and we'll give that a second just to catch up. It might take a bit longer to render now due to the appearance of the texture map. You can see we're now starting to get some information here. We're getting these kind of grimy spots that I was talking about earlier, where like water or any other kind of liquid dries on the surface of glass. You tend to get this kind of sediment. I'm not entirely sure what it is. It's probably just leftover minerals from the water, right? Drying and then appearing as a sort of a nice crust on the inside of our glass or the outside. And that's added a lot more visual interest to our glass already. It already looks more realistic and less CG now that we have this kind of breakup on the surface. And you can see how, you know, in Arnold these days and a lot of our render engines, it's really, really easy to get quick and good looking results. But if you want to push things a little bit further, you can just take a few extra steps like we've done here. And you see it only took a couple minutes. We've been recording for 8 minutes to get this set up, and a lot of that's just been me explaining to make something look a lot more realistic. But we can actually take this even further, and we'll get to that in a second. So you can see here the splotches, they're relatively large, and depending on your model, they might appear too big or they might appear too small, and maybe you might want to change the size of those. So if we come back to the Hypershade editor and click on this Place 2D Texture node, we have a setting here called Repeat UV, and there's 2 boxes, okay? So this is essentially in like 2 directions, in the U and V axes. If you think that's kind of just like X and Y, up and across. If we were to set this to 2, it would just sort of stretch it more going up. And make it look narrow. So generally you want to increase these both at the same time. If I was to decrease this number, it will make the texture map appear bigger. If I was to increase it, it will make it smaller. So let's say I wanted to make it this bigger. I would change this to something like 0.5. Okay. And again, the other one will change to 0.5. And then we come back to our render. Let that go for a minute, and you can see now as the render starts to clear up, those circles that we made previously with the texture map are now a lot bigger. Okay, and look at reference when you're doing this to kind of match something, so you know you're getting it to look correct and realistic. But ultimately this is kind of up to you. I think I'm just going to leave this at like 1.2 or something. I actually want to increase the amount of roughness we're getting on here. And a good rule of thumb is with repeat UV, the higher the number, the more the UV repeats. The lower the number, the less the UV repeats. So higher number, bigger texture, lower number, or higher number, smaller texture, lower number, bigger texture. Okay. But we can take this a step further, like I mentioned, and we can actually combine multiple texture maps into one, because right now we only have this one kind of sediment dried effect. And what if we want to add some more little specks just to make it look even better? So we'll just pause the render for the time being, come back to our Hypershade editor, and we're going to unplug this for the time being. I'll just left click and drag that away. And like before, we're going to create another file node, and this time I'm going to use a separate texture. Okay, and if you don't have a separate texture to use, you can always use the same texture you had before, but just increase the repetition or decrease the repetition to make it look different, and then use those instead. So I have a nice kind of window stain texture here that I'm going to use, and again, once we've added that, we're going to change the color space to raw again, and then turn on alpha as luminance. But how do we combine these two? Because there's only one input in the specular roughness. So what we need to do is, there's a few different ways of doing this, but this is generally how I like to do it. Type in AI composite, and what this node will do is, you can see it's got 2 inputs, A and B. Essentially, it takes 2 inputs and combines them together. It composites them together, if you're familiar with compositing. So we'll take the out color, and we can just use the out color for the time being into the composite from the 2. Plug those into A and B. Okay. And then literally all we need to do is now, instead of taking it from the files, we'll take the out color red from the AI composite and plug that into the specular roughness. If I now come back to our scene and render again, you'll see we have combined those 2 textures together. And this might take a bit longer to render now because we're using twice the number of textures. But you can see on top of already those kind of circular smudge patterns that we had, we're also getting all these little specks as well, just to add an extra little detail to this very, very dirty, crusty looking glass now. But it makes it look a lot more interesting, a lot more aged, like it's been used or sat there for a little while. And you don't necessarily have to add all this to glass. It all depends on the kind of story you're trying to tell or the kind of render you're trying to create. But generally, glass and anything transparent or shiny is going to have some imperfections, no matter how much you clean it, unless it's fresh off the factory, and even then, it probably still has some. So you can see already, just combining those 2 maps, we have a lot more visual interest. What if you actually wanted to decrease the amount here, okay? Maybe you like these patterns, but you're not quite happy with how much is going on. Maybe you want to have some crustiness, but you don't want it to look too crusty. You want it to still look like you can drink out of it and not get some sort of bowel problem. Come back to the Hypershade editor and type in AI color correct. Okay, and if you've ever done any kind of video editing or compositing, you'll be very familiar with what color correcting is. So we're going to take the out color from that, plug that directly into the input, and then the out color red from the specular roughness. The important thing to remember, the last node in the chain, you always want to take out color red, green, or blue only and plug that into specular roughness. Okay, you can also take the alpha if you want. I just like to use out color red. It's up to you. There's no really right answers there. So we have a few different sliders here, such as gamma, hue shift, saturation, contrast, but what we're looking for is the multiply and add sections. Okay, if I keep that selected, then just minimize that, we'll come back to our scene, which was still rendering, and let's say I wanted to reduce the amount of crustiness. I'm just going to drop the multiply slider here down to half. You can see already that's wiped out a lot of the crustiness. Okay, we still have a little bit, but it's way less obvious now. The glass looks a lot cleaner, a lot less aged. We could even remove it entirely if we turn the multiply all the way down, turn it back up to what it was. And this is just a value between 0 and 1 if you like. It's just black and white. We could even add more here if you wanted to. Under the add here, you can push that up to make this glass really, really dusty, crusty. You can do the same with the exposure as well, but don't put that too high, because you start to get weird artifacts like this. So good rule of thumb is to not go too far with the exposure. I generally just like to use a multiply or add, or a little bit of exposure, but not far past 1. Okay, so now we have a nice crusty looking glass. The last step we can do is add a bit of bump. Yes, glass is not always entirely smooth, especially glass bottles, and especially older ones. These days, like, glass manufacturing's got a lot better, but if you want this to look very old school, we can add some bump to this too. So come back to your Hypershade editor, go and press tab and type in AI normal map, plug the out value into the normal camera, and again we're going to take another file node. Okay, and again you can use the same map if you want, and then just change the repetition. It will have to be the normal map version of it though. You can't use a black and white texture map as a normal map. You could use it as bump. I can explain the difference in another video, but just for the purposes of today, you need a normal map. A normal map is generally going to look something like this, and essentially it's just faking surface detail without actually changing the model. It kind of fakes the light. It's going to look like this kind of kaleidoscope of color. You can also get those from Polyhaven and Ambient CG, and you can often download those in sets of PBR textures. It will give you everything from the color to the roughness to the normal as well. I'm going to take one from one I have downloaded already. And we do need to change some of the settings here. We need to change this to utility and raw again, but we don't want alpha as luminance, okay? There's a bit of a different amount of data that's coming from this image. And then we're just going to plug the color straight into input. I know this is kind of confusing, remembering which is color, which is red, out color red, or out color, or out alpha. But you'll learn pretty quickly, just because if you try to plug something into an input, it just won't let you. And you know, the right one often will just let you plug it in. So if I now come back to our render, you can see now we're getting some very, very serious bumpiness on our model, right? This looks like very imperfect glass. It's got a bunch of particles stuck in it. And you may like that, but I'm going to tone it down a little bit. If we come back to our AI normal map, you see by default the strength is at 1. I'm going to turn it down to something like 0.5. We're going to half it, just to have that be way less intense. And if I was to zoom right in and let that render for a little bit, you can see that the bumpiness will slowly come in. It might take a while to render. My computer's having a bit of a hard time today. But you can see, just by using a few individual nodes here, which really didn't take too much time at all, we can create a much more realistic and kind of weathered looking glass, which is just more interesting to look at, a bit less CG looking. We're always trying to make things look less perfect in CG, because by default they look very, very clean and perfect, which is a dead giveaway that something is CG. So we're always trying to make it look dirty and, you know, batter it up, which is what all these roughnesses and normal maps help with. So as a final step, you might want to add a little bit of color. So I'm going to select the glass shader in the Hypershade editor, just minimize that so we can see our render, and then you'll have it up here in the attribute editor. And to add color, we don't want to do that under base anymore, because the base color actually isn't doing anything now. We have all transmission, so we need to add transmission color. So I might add a bit of green. Like, sometimes glass has a bit of a color to it, not always. Coca-Cola bottles are never clear, but I might add a bit of green to mine. You might be tempted just to go all the way up to the end of green color like this. You can see that's way too green. Unless that's something you want, that's perfectly okay too. But if you want it to be subtle, just bring the slider of the saturation all the way back down to something like 0.02. And now you can see we just have a bit of a subtle green hue, nothing crazy, but it adds a bit more of a visual interest if that's what you want to go for. So now that we have a pretty convincing looking beat up glass, the last thing we can do to improve this even more is if I go ahead and just create a plane, something for this glass to sit on. Okay, we need to turn on something called caustics. And now this is quite render heavy, and Arnold is not very good at handling this. There are much better render engines for this. But we can still turn it on, and it adds a bit of extra oomph to our renders with glass. Essentially, all that caustics are patterns of bright light formed when light is reflected or refracted by curved specular roughness, or specular surfaces, sorry. These patterns occur because the curved surfaces act kind of like dynamic magnifying glasses, if you like, focusing light rays into concentrated glowing areas. You normally see this a lot on the bottom of swimming pools, shallow water, or as just bright patches on the table illuminated by like bright light or sunlight through a glass of water. So we have a very mild shadow here right now. You can see some green coming through, but we can improve this if we come to our glass shader in the attribute editor. Under transmission, you can change the shadow density. By default it's 0.5. I think that's pretty light. I like to change that to like 0.8. You can now see we are getting a bit of shadow, because despite this being transparent, you do still get some shadow from glass. Let's also come down to advanced and just turn on caustics. Now again, in Arnold this is very, very light. You're not going to notice too much of a difference, depending on your lighting setup, but you can just see it makes the shadows look a bit more accurate, and we're getting some light reflecting off of the surface here. So yeah, in a relatively short amount of time, that's how you create a much more realistic looking glass texture, or glass shader using images. And we might do another video on this, how to do it procedurally without image textures as well, because that's another way we could do this using noise maps. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this video. We're going to do this as a bit more of a series to create different kinds of shaders within Arnold and teach you guys how to do that. And yeah, if you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to ask. Always happy to answer any questions whatsoever. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.